My name is Sally Aviss and I come from Romney Marsh. So all the photographs back there are very familiar to me that Ray has talked about. My mum and my grandparents both lived in Cheriton, so I spent the first 5 years of my life in Cheriton, so I do have a claim on Folkestone, even though I now live on Romney Marsh. And the 3 books that I'm going to talk about don't actually feature in this area, but one of them does, the action does take place in Dover. But before I go on to that, I'd just like to thank Geraldine and the organisers of the Folkestone Book Festival for enabling us, local authors, to have a platform on which to talk about our books and the things that we enjoy doing. The first reading I'm going to make is taken from The Call of Cairn Moor, which is my first novel, and it just gives a flavour of the fictional Scottish island of Cairn Moor. It takes place in the House of Lords, and Alex Stewart, barrister, is protecting the islanders' rights in a court case. Alex stood up and looked around him, drawing strength from the historical significance and grandeur of his surroundings. He took his time preparing himself. A hushed, expectant atmosphere pervaded the Lord's chamber. Then Alex took a deep breath and began to speak, his words clear and his voice steady. Cairn Moor is one of the outer isles, situated some 80 miles from the west coast of Scotland. It is a remote land, a place of great beauty and undisturbed wilderness, a haven for wildlife, a land of white sandy beaches and inland fertile plains, a land where awe-inspiring mountains connect precipitously with the sea. It is a land that opens a pathway through history, with a unique sense of community forged through common purpose and the need to survive. It is subject to violent Atlantic storms, a land that can be isolated for weeks or even months at a time, and where the islanders have to be self-sufficient and self-reliant. This then is a glimpse into the character of the fictional Isle of Cairn Moor, as much a character as the people whose fortunes we follow in the novels. The Cairn Moor trilogy consists of The Call of Cairn Moor, which was published last year, Changing Times, Changing Tides, which was published in February this year, and Where Gloom and Brightness Meet, which is literally published yesterday. The 3 novels take the protagonists through a period of 33 years, from 1936 in the first, through the darker times of World War II in the second, and on to the late 1960s in the third, and follow the interwoven destinies of the Stewart family and their friends. The 3 books have been written in such a way that they can be read individually. But to read them sequentially is to understand the characters and why they do what they do, and the way that they react to the changing fortunes of their lives. The book covers are by kind permission of their artists: Kate Philp for The Call of Cairn Moor, Brian Hanson for Changing Times, Changing Tides, and Peter Tarrant for Where Gloom and Brightness Meet. Sounds like nominations, and the nominations are... The Call of Cairn Moor came about because 5 years ago, my daughter Elizabeth said that she needed another book to read. So I took a very deep breath and offered to write one for her. 6 months later, The Call of Cairn Moor was finished. As simple as that. Well, perhaps not so simple. Changing Times, Changing Tides was written immediately after that, and Where Gloom and Brightness Meet followed a year later. Once I'd started writing, it seemed I couldn't stop. I'm now on number 6, so that's on its way. I have always written short stories as a child, in my teens, the original first page, and ideas for other novels written in synoptic form when family and work commitments made it impossible for me to find time to write. I love history, and historical research is a very important part of my writing. I gain inspiration from my research and love being able to corroborate historically the ideas I have for the storylines and how many times that has happened. I mean, Peter will tell you, my husband Peter will tell you, that I said, oh, I just need this, I want to do this. Then I do the research around it and find exactly what I was looking for, and it's uncanny sometimes. And of course you do far more research, as you see from that folder, than you actually include in the novel. But it gives you a time frame, it gives you, you become immersed in your subject. I write best in the early morning, although as a teacher, that is a luxury I only have during the school holidays. When I'm back at work, it's whenever I can find an hour or two to spare at home. And I do need an hour because time takes on a different dimension during the creative process. 1, 2, or even 3 hours can go by without my noticing. The Call of Kenmore, the first in the trilogy, is a historical mystery romance. It concerns the mysterious disappearance of 2 people and their unborn child, a missing family who are now heirs to a vast fortune. In this novel, we first meet the main protagonists, Catherine MacDonald, a schoolteacher, Alexander Stewart, a barrister, his father Alistair, a solicitor, and of course, the island of Kenmore. My research and story ideas for the book drew me to remote Scottish islands, basic Gaelic. I am now the proud owner of 3 Gaelic or Gaelic dictionaries. The study of certain aspects of law, both English and Scots, transport in the 1930s, I love that photograph, Glasgow and shipbuilding on the River Clyde in the 1930s, as well as London in the same era. And those people who know me well will know that I absolutely adore London. And that photograph is just wonderful. I read and write visually. I picture the individual scenes in my mind as though they are on a film. So as well as reading books on a particular subject and using the internet, old films and photographs help me to get a feel for the period, to immerse myself in that time frame. Location visits are, of course, a necessity. And this photo was taken at the old Royal Naval College in Greenwich, a location that features in a letter from Catherine to Alistair in Changing Times, Changing Times. The thing that strikes me most, apart from the grandeur of the buildings, both inside and out, and the spaciousness of the grounds and the view of the Thames, is the beauty of the painted hall. As you walk up the steps between the pillars into the central area and see the glorious colours and vast perfect proportions, isn't it just awe-inspiring? It makes me feel enormously privileged to be here, but at the same time I'm humbled by it. I'm glad you were here too. It means I can share it with you completely. Every mealtime in the hall is a wonder, the best officer's mess anywhere. There's also such a lovely atmosphere. Was it like that when you were here? Changing Times, Changing Tides moves the action from just before the outbreak of the Second World War to just after its ending. We follow the same characters, as well as meeting some new ones, as their lives are tossed in unexpected directions by the vicissitudes of the conflict. Through the turmoil of Malaya and Singapore, and Dunkirk, particularly relevant in this 75th anniversary year of the evacuation, and on to D-Day. It is a darker novel than the first, but with tragic events tempered, I hope, by a spirit of optimism, romance, and good humour. It is a story of daring and adventure, a combination of novel and history with an unexpected twist in the tale. My factual research for this novel included the conflict in Singapore and Malaya, the Royal Naval Volunteer Reserve, the Women's Royal Naval Service, the Wrens, the evacuation of the British Army from Dunkirk, and finally, D-Day. My location research included Southwark House in Portsmouth, which is where the final plans for the D-Day landings were made, and the D-Day Museum in Hampshire, as well as the secret wartime tunnels in Dover, although Winston Churchill wasn't there when I was there. A locality that features prominently in the Dunkirk section of Changing Times, Changing Tides. I am just old enough for the Second World War to feature as an important part of my childhood, not through personal experience, but through the stories my father told me of his wartime service in the Royal Army Medical Corps. That's my dad. He'd be chuffed to see his picture. As well as many hours spent watching the best of the old war films on television, and they made them really good in those days. Any research about Dunkirk and D-Day would not be complete without the inclusion of Admiral Sir Bertram Ramsay, an unsung hero, I feel, of the Second World War, who was in charge of the evacuation from Dunkirk as Vice Admiral Dover, and who went on to mastermind the naval side of the Allied landings in North Africa and Sicily, as well as D-Day. In the novel, he began as a distant authority figure, but his character in the book had other ideas. The importance of Admiral Ramsay's character grew to such an extent that I felt I had to write to his son, Major General Charles Ramsay, to ask if he minded the inclusion of his father in a novel. He wrote back, and as requested, I sent him a draft version of Changing Times, Changing Tides, which met with his approval, and he very kindly agreed to write an afterword for the book about his father. I am delighted that my father, Admiral Sir Bertram Ramsay, should feature in this book. He was a wonderful man who had a great career in the Royal Navy and contributed enormously to the ultimate victory in World War II, mainly through commanding the Dunkirk evacuation and as Naval Commander-in-Chief on D-Day. Charles Ramsay and I have now met on two memorable occasions, once at the wartime tunnels in Dover, and again at a symposium given in honour of his father in Cambridge. And to add a personal touch, after Dunkirk, my father was stationed at Dover Castle. As far as I can ascertain, he was there at the same time as Admiral Ramsay, and I'd like to think that perhaps he saw him from a distance. My final reading is taken from Changing Times, Changing Tides, and Catherine is taking a walk along the top of the cliff looking over Dover Harbour. Splendid view, isn't it? Deep in her own thoughts, Catherine jumped at the unexpected sound. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to startle you. The man was soft-spoken, yet he had the unmistakable air of authority. He looked tired, and his skin was pale, but he seemed fully alive and cheerful in his demeanour. He sat down at the other end of the bench. His naval uniform sleeves bore the unmistakable rings of a Vice Admiral. Do you mind? Surprised, Catherine stuttered. Of course not. Could this be Admiral Ramsay, she wondered. Thank you. A moment's silence. I always think that it is a good thing to be able to escape, even if it is only for a few moments. You see, he said confidentially, any moment now, my staff officer hovering back there, and he pointed behind him, will do his best to drag me back to reality. And there's nowhere to hide, the Admiral smiled. Unfortunately not. I like to escape too. Walking is excellent in that respect. Catherine had found her voice again. I agree. So is sitting here looking out over such a vista as this. One can see almost everything. Aye, almost everything. In silence they contemplated the Straits of Dover before them, the sea sparkling in the bright sunlight, the convoy of ships leaving the harbour. Following her gaze and sensing an inner anxiety, the Admiral said, Do you have someone aboard, involved? Yes, aboard the SS Royal Bluebell. Catherine chose not to elaborate further. It was enough. She has a fine commanding officer now. Catherine felt herself blush at the praise for Alistair, but still she did not reveal the connection. Instead, she merely nodded and asked, Can it go on much longer? The Admiral looked at her sharply. An intelligent question. I hope that tonight will see the end of it. My sailors are tired. What is being asked of them is more than flesh and blood can stand. There has to be a finite time to the evacuation. It cannot continue indefinitely. At least, not without a complete change of personnel operating the ships. And there is no time to arrange for that. No. Deferentially, his staff officer approached, and the Admiral stood up, his manner cheerful once again. I have to go, I'm afraid. My brief respite is at an end. I shall leave you to enjoy your solitude. Goodbye, Admiral Ramsay, and good luck. Thank you. He paused. How do you know who I am? Catherine smiled. Oh, you're quite famous, you know. Really? He seemed genuinely surprised. Smiling and with a lightness of step, he returned to the staff car parked by the side of the road. Catherine watched until the car had disappeared on the remainder of its short journey up the hill to Dover Castle, perched high on the chalk cliffs, beneath which were the casemate tunnels where Admiral Ramsay had his operational headquarters. Their chance encounter left Catherine feeling glad that she had met him. Now she would be able to picture the man upon whose shoulders rested the ultimate responsibility for the success of the evacuation. The third novel in the trilogy, Where Gloom and Brightness Meet, completes them. It takes the action forward into the late 1960s, as well as recalling the familiar characters' lives from the intervening years. It is a story of heartbreak and redemptive love, of long-dead passion remembered and remained in isolation, of unfaltering loyalty and steadfast devotion. It is a story that juxtaposes the old and the new, and reflects the conflicting attitudes, problems and joys of a liberating era. And it is a story that brings the reader home to the Isle of Cairnmore. Thank you for listening, and I hope that this brief glimpse into the Cairnmore trilogy will make you want to buy one, or even all of them. Thank you.